I want to begin the presentation this morning by looking at the context, the social context of this issue, and doing that within the context of this country. So I'm not going to be looking at what's happening in Europe or Asia or Africa. I'm going to be looking at what's happening in the United States among the clergy and among the people that are involved in formation, in particular here in the United States. But let me begin doing just a bit of background and looking at a few questions that hopefully will help guide our understanding. What I want to begin looking at is the social and political changes. I'm not going to exhaust this, don't worry. Or if you don't like social and political changes, conversations, you can put your heads down for now, and I'll wake you up when the good stuff starts. But I do think it's important for us to try and understand how this issue has become such an important issue for us today by looking at the social and political changes that it represents. And I want to begin just by alluding to a film. And I don't know, Father Garrick isn't here. He could tell us all about the film, which would completely exhaust our patience. But the film is called 1900, and it's by the Italian filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci. And the film was a very important film that came out in the early 70s because it really kind of set an ideal or kind of set a tone for the development of culture beginning in 1900. And what Bertolucci alludes to, and what I think has become a major kind of theme, is that 1900 and the decade or so after 1900 really represents a major shift in the population's attitude about the world in itself. And this film is very good because it shows the way in which that happened and why it happened, and such things as the rise of the middle class and the concurrent kind of dissolution of the aristocracy. Because really, before 1900, most people thought about the history of the world as the history of the aristocracy or royal families or whatever it may be. But this film shows that beginning really in 1900, we begin to see more of a focus on the middle class and even other classes of society. And so that is going to be kind of the theme that I'm hoping to kind of allude to here. Also, the impact we had of 2 world wars, and it's impossible to overestimate the significance of these war issues. World War I and World War II were significant. They were significant to us, I believe, not because they were fought on our soil, for the most part, except for Pearl Harbor. They were not fought on our soil as much. But what we do know is that, especially with World War II, it's very interesting that World War II mobilized about a quarter of the male population of the United States and a large percentage of the female population of the United States to go to places where they would have never thought to go before, and that is, for example, Asia or Europe, to experience in those places not only the devastation of war, but also the presence of other cultural realities. So if we could think about just the question of the male population going to Europe in World War II, that population represented literally thousands of times the number of people, men or women, who had gone to Europe before that time, or had seen cultures from Europe. That, of course, didn't come from there, right? That didn't come as part of the immigrant population. What the most important things, though, I think that happened in the context of these world wars is, first, social equalization. That we begin to see that this hierarchy that we had experienced so much of in the past now begins to level off. And we have kind of a leveling of the social orders and not so much these upper classes and other classes that are not a part of one another's lives, except, of course, in servitude, for example. The other thing I think we see is the redefinition of gender roles, not exclusively, but a redefinition in ways that would not have been thought possible before the events of these two world wars. And finally, one of the things that we really experience, and something that is going to have a much more long-term effect, is the question of agnosticism. So what happens after, particularly World War II, is that the faith of people, not only in Europe, but also in this country, begins to wane. And we begin to see a rise in the idea of agnosticism or a lack of faith in God. Now, some people, and I would be one of them, so I'm saying some of us, believe that part of the church's response to World War II was an attempt at overcoming this kind of growing sense of, if not direct agnosticism, at least an indifference to religion that really emerges during that time. And so, for example, the document written by Pope Pius XII, Munificentissimus Deus, on the idea of the Assumption of Mary, many people kind of think about what in the world did that have to do with anything in the 1950s. But what it really was a response to a growing agnosticism of after World War II by pointing to the realities of what happens in the afterlife, whether it was successful or not. I would also say that the Second Vatican Council was very much a product of this equalization of culture that began with World War I, but certainly was brought into greater focus in World War II. So what we begin to see is a falling off of religious faith and an equalization of people within the culture. And I hope to be able to demonstrate a little bit about what that might mean, if you care. But the response of the church, as I mentioned, really is beginning to kind of characterize for us the 1950s. Now, here I think what we're finding in the 1950s is a rather pronounced attempt at what we might think of as cultural stabilization, a way of getting the culture stabilized after the 1940s, which was that period of upheaval. But I would say two things have happened. One is, in that time itself, the project of stabilization was more or less, often less successful. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But what also happened in that time period is a kind of idealization of American culture that began to emerge. And I would say the Cunningham family really represents this kind of ideal. If anybody can, everybody can. Remember Happy Days, the show from the 1970s, early 80s, which really was an idealization of what American life, American families were like in the 1950s. And a very nice one, you know, except we don't really know what happened to Richie's older brother. He just kind of disappeared one season and never returned. I don't know, I think he must have got into LSD or something. But the whole premise of the show and other shows, remember that a lot of our culture is really capsulized in the manifestations of that culture in popular entertainment. So you look, for example, at Leave It to Beaver. And you know, the greatest problem that a person can have is somebody's baseball went through somebody's window, you know, or you know that Eddie Haskell is lying again about nothing significant, and Mrs. Cleaver is doing all of her housework, including baking, in high heels. I mean, this was not real, but we have found a way to idolize that culture, looking back on those programs. But I would say we've also done that in the context of the church in some ways. And I would say that many of the tensions we're feeling in church life today proceed from an idealization of culture, including church culture, from say the 1950s. So we're really trying to think, oh, wasn't Mass much better in the 1950s? And weren't priests more like priests in the 1950s? Now, if any of us were around in the 1950s, none of you were, but you know that's not true necessarily. Things were not ideal, including the church's life, not ideal. But nevertheless, that has become a kind of marker, a social marker for us. We witnessed at the end of the 50s a kind of ideological shift that comes about. And I would say from a cultural point of view, this is very, very well represented in the 1957 musical West Side Story. Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim created this musical in 1957 as their own way of commenting on what the 1950s were all about. Not from the standpoint of the Cleavers in their lovely neighborhood, but from the standpoint of rival gangs on the west side of New York City. And here, this idea of rivalry, this idea of gangs, this idea of poverty, this is very not much in keeping with the ideals represented by a lot of sitcoms from the 1950s. There was an ideological shift away from idealism toward a kind of cynicism, which I believe West Side Story represents very nicely, including when we see it was quite a cleaned up version by Steven Spielberg from a couple of years ago, but the basis of the story remains. There's an excellent book, and if you've never read it, shame on you, shame, no, not really. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it. It's called The Way We Never Were by a sociologist named Stephanie Kuntz. And the book is really about that idealization of culture that existed in the 1950s and what it was like during those great, era of proms and sock hops and high school drama and all the wonderful things that family represented, which never were, according to Stephanie Kuntz. And she has this very interesting statistic, for example, that the use of psychotropic drugs by American housewives was higher in the 1950s than it was in the 1960s. That more housewives were self-medicating in the 50s than in the 60s. So think about that, and you can ask yourself why your mother left that cake in the oven so long. Then we have the 1960s. Now the 1960s, as all of us know, was a time of tremendous social change, tremendous social upheaval. And I'll just mention a few of these things because we do eventually probably want to get to our topic of discussion. First of all, the civil rights movement, which was a major theme of the late 50s and early 60s. And I would say the first phase of the civil rights movement really doesn't end until 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It is also the topic, interestingly to me, of the way in which culture has rethought the early civil rights movement in recent films, for example. Very important. And then really the entirety of the 1960s is framed by the assassination of the Kennedys, John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King in 1968. The idea of the Vietnam War, which became a real testing ground for political ideas. We see, for example, recent conversations about Lyndon Johnson and his understanding of the Vietnam War. But really what the 60s represent is a kind of social instability. Whether we wanted to be a socially unstable culture, it doesn't really matter, but in fact we were. And part of this is due again to the changes that we began to see. And I would say that the kind of rise of an overt drug culture, which is just now in many ways coming to fruition, was also part of that. The 1970s, Watergate, and I think that it's intriguing to me that the issue of the event of the Watergate crisis in the early 70s is just now, I think, being analyzed for its impact on the social order. What we see is the rise of individualism as a major kind of theme. In other words, I'm not going to be concerned so much about the culture in which I'm living. I'm going to be concerned about myself. And sometimes that even begins to translate, and I think we're still seeing the outcome of that, into, for example, family life, social life in the neighborhood, political life. We see this as a cultural marker in, say, film and television. I don't know if any of you remember, but in 1968, there was an important book and film that came out called Rosemary's Baby. Now, you may not remember Rosemary's Baby, and the actual Rosemary's Baby, I hope you don't remember. But I have this fresh in my mind because I'm teaching a course on this in the fall, that it began a very important kind of theme that begins to emerge in the 70s, which I would say is the theme of the evil child, or the way in which children are viewed as something sinister. And we see that in all kinds of films. The Exorcism, we see that in the Omen series from that period. In other words, children are problematic. Children are a part of our culture that we really don't want to deal with. And this is very different from, say, the idealization of childhood that came in the 19th century. Why? Because children represent a lack of sexual freedom. And I don't think it's incidental that the Roe v. Wade issue comes right in the middle of this kind of cultural upheaval. You say, please get to the topic here, the topic. Let's talk about the topic. Let's talk about the sexual abuse crisis. And this is the only time I'm going to really talk directly about Catholic problems or issues. In the Catholic Church in general, and these are very general numbers, there have been 5,000 abusive priests identified since the 90s. And these abusive priests have really kind of run the gamut. Many of them, and I would say a majority of them, at least initially, had been ordained before 1980. But 5,000 seemingly identified abusive priests, of which only 150 have been prosecuted in the United States. So that leaves 4,850 who have never been prosecuted. However, there have been over 3,000 lawsuits filed against priests or against dioceses relating to this question, and it's cost the church $3 billion since the emergence of the crisis in the late 90s and the early 21st century. In 2004, the John Jay report gave a very kind of, for the time, exhaustive understanding of this crisis, and then it was followed in 2005 by the Dallas Charter, which provided for the means by which the church could directly deal with the abuse crisis. Now, again, my focus today is not on that topic, but I do believe that that topic has to be in the background of our minds. And I say our, by that I mean those of us who work in the area of formation. We cannot do formation today without having some insight, some background in the abuse crisis and what has happened and what we hope will not happen again. And I'll talk about that a little bit when we get into it, but again, not so much. Let's look at some statistics, though. This is not relating to the church. This is general statistics relating to the problem of abuse, the question of abuse in culture in general. What we know, and this is what we know, is that 20% of all women in the United States have suffered some form of sexual abuse as a minor. So we're talking about 11 to 17 is basically the age group. So 20% of all women and 25% of all men have suffered some form of sexual abuse as a minor during this same time period or today. What's interesting to me is that for women, 81% of the women who have experienced this have reported it. If not officially, but to someone, they have reported it. So in other words, they told a family member, or they told a trusted neighbor, or they told their clergy, but not necessarily a law enforcement officer, but 81% have at least been able to talk about it or express it to someone. That number halves when we talk about males who have experienced sexual abuse. Only 40% have reported. So it's interesting that we have more males having experienced abuse, but only half of the males that have experienced abuse have reported it. And all of these really between the ages of 11 and 17. What's also interesting is when we talk about perpetrators. For women, their perpetrators are almost always a known person. In other words, it's a family member or it's somebody that they know rather well. And the outcome of that, of course, is somewhat different. With men, it is more often that they are an unknown perpetrator. In other words, someone random or someone that is going to take advantage of them, but not someone necessarily from their own family, though, of course, that is also the case. What's interesting when you look at male sexual abuse, it is almost half and half when you look at sexual abuse of men, half and half between male and female known perpetrators. So young men, adolescent men, are just as likely to be abused by a female as they are by a male perpetrator. And I thought that was interesting. My question today focuses from the work that we have been doing with ATS, and particularly on this book called Men Too. And the book, which if you anybody familiar with this book at all, has anyone read it? Nobody. Okay. Read it. Especially if you're involved in any kind of parish life. Really, if you're involved in anything, read this book. And I think it's important for us to read it because it shows so much of what we don't know or what we're not talking about. And it helps us to frame some important questions that we should be having and are not. And so that's what I want to spend the rest of the time focusing on this morning. So we're about half through, so just, you're all right, hold on, we'll be fine. So I'm going to now begin to look at the question of not what happens in formation, but what happens to seminarians and the seminarian population. So basically this is, from my perspective, a male population between the ages of 18 and 30. So that's kind of the breadth of the population that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm doing this not because I'm kind of trying to discount in any way other groups. I'm doing this because this is what I can talk about, because this is the thing about which I have hopefully some knowledge and some insight. But let's just look at what I want to talk about in terms of seminarians. In looking at overall statistics, we have overall statistics that are somewhat low in terms of reporting. Why? Because in males of this time frame, this age group, abuse is way underreported. But let's look a little bit about what we do know about those who are in formation. So, the number of abused males is higher in a seminarian population than it is in the general population. More men have experienced sexual abuse in their younger years, and sometimes even ongoing, in the seminarian population than in the general population. So a real question that I think that as seminary formators we have to ask ourselves is why? Why are men who have been sexually abused attracted to life at the seminary? And some of you may be formulating some potential answers already, but don't rush yourselves. Don't hurt yourselves either. But let's just look at some of the symptoms of what we are experiencing. So what we know, and I can say these in very general terms. So for example, in my current population of seminarians, I would say it is not problematic to think of a substantial number of those seminarians. I'm not saying the majority by any means, but I'm also not saying a very low minority have experienced some form of sexual abuse in their past. What we see in that is, first of all, an overwhelming sense of what I call free guilt. That is to say, guilt related to, it's just, when I begin talking about this, I find it's very troubling, because, I can see it all the time. Seminarians who feel guilty about nothing. In other words, they're guilty, they feel bad, I feel like I've done something wrong, I need to go to confession every other day. Free guilt. There's no real thing that's caused it, they have not done anything, they just feel guilty. And I would say this is a very observable reality among young people today. Perhaps women as well as men. We see a great deal of pornography and masturbation as elemental in the lives of young men today. The average age, interestingly enough, for a first exposure to pornography among men is age 8. They begin watching and have escalated their pornography use into their teen years. Many young men today, both in and out of the seminary, are desperately addicted to pornography and masturbation. And so it's a question that we have to begin to raise. And I think so many times in other seminary contexts, there is this idea that if this is an issue for a person, either they should not be involved in the seminary, and I would say if that's the criteria for not being a seminarian, we have very, very few, maybe no seminarians. But the other side of it is that the answer to an addiction to pornography is to stop. And I would say a habit that has developed in young men for 15 years is not going to stop just because somebody tells them not to do it. So that becomes one of the questions that I think we have to deal with. Another symptom that we see among some seminarians is a lack of an ability to identify personal information or to tell their story. And it is not incidental that we require seminarians to submit an extensive autobiography. Because we want to see what they've experienced, certainly, but we also want to see what they're not talking about. And it's very interesting that the number of seminary applications that we can review in which there are periods of time missing from the application. Or it can be a lack of personal interaction, and we see this as well. As some of you know, at St. Meinrad, we try to have what we call an open door policy, so that you don't have to keep your door open all the time. Sometimes they try that, and I'm like, close your damn door. Nobody wants to see you in your nightcap, or having a nightcap. But what we do experience is people who will not open their door, and they don't want their room to be seen, they don't want themselves to be seen, and they mostly retreat to the room and never come out during their time. And you begin to wonder. Now, I'm not saying that all of these are symptoms of sexual abuse, but I'm saying if we do have an abuse problem or an issue that has arisen in the past, then that's going to be the. I would also say that another one of the issues that we face quite a lot in seminary life today is a question of what I would call formalism, of a very formal approach to the life of the seminary, a very formal approach to church life, and particularly perhaps a very formal approach to the liturgy and prayer. We want this to be a certain way. We want it to be designed like this. We want it to be executed like this. And my prayer includes this, 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 and this, and nothing more. Or my prayer includes this amount of time and nothing more. Or I have all of these priorities, but I don't really want to talk about or can't even explain why they're my priorities. And all of these things are some questions that arise. How do we deal with the question of past abuse? How do we deal with the problem that we experience? And again, I would say, and I'm throwing numbers out that may have little or no meaning. Every year, I would say, either through the evaluation, the application process, the evaluation process, or a personal contact with me, I learn of a number of seminarians who have experienced sexual abuse. The others I have no direct evidence for, but I do understand what some of these symptoms are, and I would be willing to bet that those are some of the issues with which we're dealing. So how do we encourage seminarians who I believe, and I know, will have a higher percentage of sexual abuse than some of the people with whom they are contemporary? How do we deal with it? First of all, I think it's necessary, and I would say this across the board, to offer seminarians a safe environment. My task as the rector, I frequently tell people, is not to throw people out of the seminary. Sometimes people do need to leave formation, but that's not my job. My job is to help people stay in the seminary and find ways in which that can happen. And sometimes it's by providing a safe environment. I always think that we have issues when seminarians, there's so many new alumni in this room. I don't want to give away all of my secrets, how we dealt with you. But there's so many times in which a seminarian needs to have the sense that he is in a safe environment. And almost all the times we see a kind of closed-off seminarian is because he doesn't feel safe. If he doesn't trust the formation staff, it's probably because he has not been raised to trust people, including his parents or including the people around him. We have to be able to give seminarians confidential resources. And this is you would be amazed at what a controversy this is right now in the seminary world, is whether there should be the ability for a seminarian to gain confidential resources in the seminary. And by those resources, I mean psychological counseling and spiritual direction. And there are many seminaries in this country, I would say a half of them at least today, who require seminarians to sign a waiver when they come in that says, if they talk to a psychologist, that psychologist can go directly to the rector to give what happened in that counseling session. Or their spiritual director can go directly to the rector to talk about their counseling session. I believe this is a tragedy of modern formation and really a mistake that seminaries are making. I talked to a seminarian not long ago who's from a different seminary. I won't mention the name of the seminary, but it's in St. Louis. And he told me, and this was verified because the pastor of his parish had sent it to me. He told me that he was not allowed in the seminary to to have conversation with his pastor while he was in the seminary. And I'm like, okay, why? Because the pastor may be telling him things that are more troubling to his formation and not in keeping with what the seminary is telling him. And I'm like, maybe I'm just lazy. But if a pastor wants to help out, God bless him, And frankly, come here and work as far as I'm concerned. Seminaries, though, need, at least in the early years of their formation, need a place where they can go for confidential conversation. Because nothing is going to happen in terms of a safe environment if the threat of exposure of my most embarrassing secrets is there all the time. We have to encourage communication, but not demand it. In other words, I think every seminarian, I hope every seminarian in the seminary knows that if they want to come to talk to me, they can talk. They know it's an external forum, but they will do it. And I have this experience constantly. The number of seminarians that talk to me about really what I would think of as internal forum matters come to me and talk to me about it, and I say, this is external forum anyway. I think in dealing with abuse, it's important that people know that they can talk to people, and not just their peers, but also people in authority, professionals within the seminary, but also their peers. So the professional and peer support become essential. And that's why building relationships in the seminary becomes a very important kind of way of doing things. And then I think it's important for us, for the seminary staff, the formation personnel, to be able to read the seminarian, even when the seminarian cannot read himself. In other words, we have to be able to help to discuss questions, to deal with issues, even when he is not able to do that. Not by forcing it, but by our willingness to listen, to say to the seminarian, why don't you go talk to Sister Diane? Because I think she would have a lot of insight here. Or talk to your spiritual director about this or this. Okay. What are the effects of the abuse that young people are experiencing, in particular for seminarians? The effects of abuse are never neutral. But many young men especially are led to believe that abuse and the effects of abuse ought to be neutral. In other words, and if you read this book, which I highly recommend, I'm not giving a cut, I promise, I'm just asking you to read it. If you read this book, what you find out is that most men are under-reporting sexual abuse because A, they feel guilty about it, and B, because they think that that's how they're supposed to be initiated into sexual life, adult sexual life. In other words, it's not, but nevertheless it's there. And I think one of the effects of abuse is that a man finds that he is thinking of himself as defined by his sexual past. I did these things were problematic, whether I did them or whether they were done to me, and I'm defined by that. A man is not defined by his sexual past or even his sexual present. Whether we're talking about events that took place, whether we're talking about orientation, no matter what we're talking about, you're not defined by the past. However, we must deal with the outcomes of that past. In other words, just to suppress events that happened in the past, they're not going to go away because we don't think about them. We have to think about them, and then we have to find a way to successfully deal with them. So this happens really in the context of human formation. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of insight into your sexual history by, doing church history or whatever. Hope not, anyway. But human formation is the area in which this is supposed to happen. And the three kind of ways of understanding this that we find in the PPF are, I think, essential. Self-knowledge, self-possession, self-gift. And these are three kinds of insights for the person that are cumulative. In other words, we begin with self-knowledge, then self-possession, and then self-gift. Let me talk a little bit about each one. First of all, do you know yourself? Do you know who you are? Do you understand yourself? And do you accept yourself? And part of this is accepting and acknowledging the gifts that we have. And some people, I think it's very interesting in talking to seminarians, sometimes they're not in any way able to name their gifts. They're not able to say, I'm really good at this, or this is really a positive thing for me. They can't do it. Sometimes the important thing for self-knowledge is the ability to identify challenges and the ability to be angry about them. In other words, if I experience something in the past, I may need to be angry about that. But of course, living in this kind of religious, pious culture in which we sometimes find seminarians growing up, it's not permissible to be angry about what's happened. Be angry. I say, if something has happened to you, or you've experienced this or that in the past, it is okay to be angry with that. And it's even okay to be angry with God. If you can't find another person to be angry at, be angry with God. He can do it. He can take it, no problem. The thing that I think self-knowledge involves is an understanding of past sinfulness. And many, as I said, seminarians today are acutely aware of their past sin, but also aware of their present virtue. This is what has happened to me, yes, but this is who I am today. This is who I am. And to be able to say that positively, not only about the gifts, but also about the problems and sin. But I would say that this leads to kind of two deterrents to formation. And I would say that if a seminarian today is experiencing either one of these, they are not only deterrents, but they prohibit the person. First is a lack of ability to know oneself. But the second is, and sometimes related to it, is narcissism. If you are clinically diagnosed with a form of narcissism, then you cannot be in the seminary. And I believe that this question of narcissism is one that has really been a real problem in the past, and particularly in the areas of abuse. That most of, I have no statistics, but I would say many priest abusers of the past would be diagnosed as clinical narcissists. And one of the questions of clinical narcissism is this: whatever the rules are, they don't apply to me. I don't need to follow the rules because I know better. Okay. To self-knowledge is to know and understand my relationship with God and to be on a kind of personal relationship with God as opposed to a fearful relationship with God. And here's the secret that I tell all seminarians, and they never believe me, is that sometimes the problems that we've experienced, and even our sin, are the key to pastoral success. In other words, our failures are sometimes the key to helping others, if we can allow that, to happen. Self-possession, after we know who we are, and have accepted at some level who we have to then begin to act like who we are. Using the resources that are given to us, and using them exhaustively. Finding ways to have confidential conversations. Again, not being defined by my past issues. And not living as a victim. Not living as a victim. And of course, part of the self-possession can only come from having this relationship with God. What happens in a breakdown of self-possession? One becomes an automaton. In other words, the personality of the person is lost. And boy, do I see it. I see it all the time. You look this way, you dress this way, you have this haircut, you're perfectly aligned with all of Father Manners, and there's just nothing behind it all. And you see that. This is really a lack of emotional maturity. It's a lack of the ability to engage one at an emotional level, or an extreme bifurcation. And we see that. You're either this or you're that. And I would say when we look at the church today at large, not just the people in it, but the church at large, this extreme bifurcation is something we're seeing a lot more of. We are either all over on this side or we're all over on this side, and nobody walks down the middle. And here I would say there's an absolute need for these internal four solutions. Self-gift. This is what comes after the other two phases. Use what has happened for sympathy and empathy. In other words, if I've had an experience and if I've had a negative experience and I have overcome that negative experience, I can use that to help others with my self-knowledge. Providing safe space for other people. And I would say this especially to the priest. I think one of the most important things that we can do is provide safe spaces for people to talk. And often this takes place in the sacrament of reconciliation. And I just want to put in a plug here. You know, I know that for many priests, going to the confessional, reconciliation room, whatever, at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon may not be on the top of your to-do list of things that you're going to find very invigorating. Because what you know, of course, is that most of your business is going to be the steady regulars, you know, the one that was in last week and the week before and the week before. And sometimes you're going to have people who come in and they're completely unaware of even how to engage the sacrament. And it's been 23 years since my last confession. You know, this is the thing I tell the guys. And if a person has a negative experience in reconciliation, chances are that's it for them. They're just going to walk away. Because what we find in reconciliation is that we find people at their most vulnerable. It takes a lot to go into that little closet. Unless, of course, you're one of the regulars and you look forward to it. But it takes a lot to go into that little room and say your sins to somebody that you don't even know. You know, if we're not compassionate and easy on those people, I think we're eventually going to lose them. And that I would apply that into a broader perspective of our patience with people, like, for example, in this formation context, is all about how well we engage them and how patiently and sympathetically we engage them. You know, and yes, Junior, you're acting like an asshole, but I know why you're acting like an asshole. And I can have sympathy for that. Sometimes I might act like an asshole too. When we see the breakdown of self-gift, then we see selfishness, right? Or a sense of intellectual superiority to others, or sarcastic temperament, or kind of the inability to maintain relationships. All of these pieces, and we see it really all the time. What is our goal? Well, eventually, my colleagues and I hope to found a project called the Tarcisius Project. It's looking at 3 kinds of ways of engaging publics. Education, and we're talking here about people who have been sexually abused. Acknowledging the truth, understanding, that is naming hope. Not to survive, but to thrive. Right? And then empowerment, open spaces, internal and external ways of communication. We cannot change the past, But we must not be cynical about the present because of what has happened in the past. And we must not despair for the future. And how can we do that? Talk to someone. Talk to God. Help others in order to help yourself. And finally, open your heart to love. Sin, no matter if it's our own or sin that has been perpetrated against us, can become virtue. And I think that's one of the most important lessons, particularly for us in our context, that we can teach to emerging priests. Thank you. If anyone has questions afterward or things that come up or things you'd like to speak about less publicly, there's two ways of getting in touch with me, so please do not hesitate to do that. But right now, if anybody would like to ask questions, I would certainly be very welcome. Yes?
Just a couple thoughts. Speaking about this sexual abuse is almost a rite of passage and expectation, whether it's overt or not. An implicit thing coupled with the culture not giving us permission to talk about that. Some cultures, there's a built-in rite of passage and there's certain things that you do, whether it's sexually abusive or not. From our perspective, a lot of those might be. But if these things are happening and people are taught to tolerate that or to expect it, that thwarts our ability to encourage people to come forward and talk.
Right.
The other piece comes from that is the whole society's implicit or explicit expectation that to become a man, a person must get over their traumas and get over themselves.
Yeah, and that's certainly true, which is it's an interesting perspective when we have tried to really overcome that kind of stereotype for 50 years, but we haven't done it yet.
And then there's a perceived sense of weakness.
Right.
And so that's, your safe environment piece and all those things were resonating.
If I was sexually abused as a child, it was because either I wanted to do that, and we see this everywhere. It's usually the argument of the abuser. It's because I wanted to do it or because it was a rite of passage that I needed to go through to make me into the man I am.
So how do we assist people? That's part of the question.
Right. But I believe there is an internal kind of sense of, even though some of those might be the openly stated expectations, I believe most people know what abuse is. And I believe, and this comes out very well in this book, is that, well, I was involved with this, and maybe everyone at the time thought that I should be doing it, but I knew it was wrong. I knew it was wrong. Not wrong necessarily in the moral sense, but wrong in the psychological sense. In other words, it wasn't what sexuality is supposed to be. And from the person who's abused, yeah. I knew it was wrong.
And they may not have the power to stop.
And they may not have the power to stop it, or feel that they can't stop it just because of maybe who the abuser is. Good, thank you. Yes?
Since everything that God created is good, and since God created us the ability to enjoy sexual pleasure, therefore, why is it wrong for priests to get married? And at the same time, why is it wrong for anyone to enjoy the sexual pleasure outside of the legitimate marriage?
Well, that's not what this talk is about.
That's where the sexual abuse came in. And that's the reason why you have the sexual abuse. Because they don't know the answer to this question.
Well, I
Do
don't
you
know.
know the answer?
Other questions? that there's a movement among some seminary formation today that we shouldn't really have internal forum. That all of the seminarians' life really should be an open book because of the nature of the vocation to which he feels called. And so therefore, why is there anything that's not open? Well, I would say there are two pieces to that. First of all, I think a training in confidentiality is an essential component of priesthood training, just because of the nature, for example, of the relationship in the sacrament of reconciliation. But we also see that, that seminarians are being told that their life is an open book. But you know as well as I do from dealing with any young people that they need that place of confidence, at least initially in their formation, to be able to talk about things that they feel are problematic or embarrassing or difficult, no matter what that is. So I do think it's a big mistake that seminaries are making in downplaying the importance of confidentiality. But I also say to almost all of the seminarians, in the context of the year, I say, eventually your life is an open book. But you have to open that book. You're the one that has to open the book. And that's an important piece of self-revelation as opposed to, I feel the need to do that because I'm in this relationship in the seminary. And so, I think those are some of the issues that you're facing. Yeah. For the missing?
We are all wounded.
Yes.
Part of the seminary is finding healing in our brokenness.
Yes.
And being able to get to that self-healing.
Yeah.
So
you paid attention when I was talking.
And try not to be but when does the seminary not need to be the place of healing for somebody and maybe give us more?
Yes, that can be the case. Sometimes, of course, we're dealing in the seminary we're trying to deal with what I would call usual formation. In other words, we acknowledge that everyone has this, and we acknowledge that everyone has challenges, but whether those challenges are pathological becomes the issue, right? And what I'm saying is there are certain times in a seminary environment where pathological issues emerge that did not come out in the initial screening of the seminarian. And we have to say, no, it's time for you to deal with this question, and then maybe come back later. Because what we do find, and I do think this is the case, is that a lot of seminarians initially come to seminaries as a way of trying to say, I will never have to deal with this question again because I'm going to be a priest. And that's problematic. But, and I do think a number of people come in with that. I hope they don't stay with that. But there are certain presenting things that occasionally cannot be overcome through the regular channels of formation that need to be dealt with. And so, and I would say one of those is clinical narcissism. And I would say that almost, I can say this pretty much in confidence, almost every seminarian that I've had to dismiss, almost every, refused to accept the fact that they should be dismissed. And that's because they were suffering from a kind of clinical narcissism. They didn't think if they did it, it wasn't wrong, even though if somebody else did it, they would think it was wrong. But if they did it, it wasn't wrong. Yeah.
How would I know from the ordination class before? If you're a pastor and you're advising a young man who may have a vocation to go to seminary, or you're giving spiritual direction, you may find yourself dealing with internal form issues that you may have to make a recommendation about them going to seminary. And so that we kind of navigate. But if you're is it good to raise some of these issues with the young man who may be speaking with? Should that have to be deferred to the vocation director or to plan formation?
I don't know. I think it depends on what you're dealing with. What is your relationship with the man who's going into seminary or thinking about it. And that, as you say, becomes a bit of a challenge at times to balance an internal and external forum, giving a recommendation, etc. And that's something I think that's something that priests have to wrestle a little bit with in terms of their conscience. Or if there becomes a point in your formation, in the process for the application, for example, where the pastor would say, I'm going to defer this to the associate to write the letter. But then I would write a letter, and we do see this, in which the pastor says, I have had an internal forum relationship with this young man. And that's true of almost anybody who's been in your parish. Chances are you've heard his confession at some point. But I've had an more extensive internal forum relationship with him. So I defer to the associate pastor to write this letter or whatever. And I think that's always perfectly permissible. I would say it applies in a lot of circumstances, but it is probably not as observed in some situations. The other piece of it is, when do you allow the vocation director to kind of become the major agent of formation in terms of helping them discern their future and what they're going to do? And I think the sooner the better. The sooner you can get a seminarian to the vocation director. One of the things I think we have noticed in seminary formation in the past number of years is the number of people who are like, I've been talking to my pastor about this for about 14 years. And I said, why haven't you go to the vocation director? I didn't even know there was a vocation director. And it's like, okay, Junior, you're not going to make it. But anyway, and I'm not going to put up with you for 14 years. So hopefully that helps you. Lou.
If you could just comment a little bit on when you talk about external form and internal form, and deal with abuse and things like that. How much of that is handled by the spiritual director? And how much of that is handled by counseling relationships? I think that, for me, as a spiritual director, it's the age of question of, when to refer to, when, okay, now this is a little direction relationship.
Well, okay, so we're talking about kind of spiritual questions versus legal questions, right? So for example, when does the internal form apply to counselors? Well, it applies to counselors until someone says, I was sexually abused by so-and-so when I was 12 years old. Well, that has to be reported. I think, in looking at that as kind of a standard, for those of us in spiritual direction relationships, when something comes up like, this happened to me as a minor, I think it's important for us to say, and the person who was perpetrating the abuse was not a minor, that's a legal question, and I think we need to get that person. Saying, I'll support you in every possible way, I'll even go with you, but you need to report this. As an investor, of course, you have no ability to report anything. So, and that becomes the kind of the gray area. What is spiritual direction? And that's why I think, for example, if you're engaging spiritual direction, which you do so beautifully here, you need to be able to say to the person, okay, we've finished spiritual direction, and now we're going to the confession, and not let the two things bleed into each other. That's just my perspective. Are there other questions?
I don't know what my question is.
Okay. Well, let me help you decide that.
I'm not hearing much about the responsibility of an institution, be it the church, be it the seminary, or whatever, to deal with the abuser as opposed to the abused. Power struggle,
No, I don't think we have a responsibility necessarily to deal with the abuser. I mean, we do in terms of legal issues sometimes, but I'm not concerned about how the abuse happened or even with whom it happened. In a seminarian scenario, I'm concerned about that person.
Correct. But what happens if a seminarian comes to you and says, the professor did this?
Oh, no, that's a completely different scenario. I don't have to deal with both. I have to deal with him, but I have to deal with the professor. We have completely outlined legal ramifications of that. Don't even think about that. Don't even think about it.
sat on the licensure board for the mental health profession, and there are people that have power struggles. The abused is so intimidated by the power of the abused.
Yeah. And that's what I think, in some ways, in that kind of scenario, I would have to act as the buffer. And I would have to reassure the abused person that we're not favoring the abuser just because he happens to be employed by us. You see what I'm saying?
And this won't happen to him because he's not going to be employed by us.
No, he's not. Right. No, it's not going to happen. And we already know the ramifications of letting that sort of thing slide.
A lot of what I thought we were talking about was normal age development, whatever we want to call it, as opposed to, your normal development when you're a 40-year-old professor
Isn't to abuse 20-year-old students.
but it happens.
It does happen. And we can talk about abuse that is, abuse that is between adults. But what constitutes abuse between two adults? One thing what constitutes it is often the power differential. That I have a power situation that I'm dealing with. And I would say for priests, we always have a power differential. In other words, there's no such thing as a consensual sexual relationship with a priest. Because the priest has power over the person. Yeah.
Is there some sense that this new propedeutic stage will begin to help at an earlier stage or then for the immediate healing?
Yeah, I hope so. And we're certainly raising these questions. And of course, part of what you have to do is just say, this is what's happening. Not say it's happening to you, or did it happen to you, or raise it so that people know that there are certain issues that can be discussed in the context. But I think one of the advantages, and it's an advantage across the board of the propedeutic stage, is the fact that they can breathe a little bit, and they can really concentrate on human formation issues, not just this issue, but all issues, and spiritual formation issues without having the pressure of being in class and having to do that sort of thing. So, yes, I think that's an area for this to happen. Other questions? Yes?
I'm trying to internalize everything that you said.
I wouldn't.
All these things that you mentioned, are they from the perspective of the contextual discussion? Are these from the perspective of the abuse or the abuser?
I don't know that I understand the question.
Well, going back to the
I'm interested in why people abuse at some level, but I'm not really interested in it. I'm really interested in more in the consequences of abuse. And I can say, for example, I know why okay, let me put this in my own context, right? So why was it that priests that were operating in a certain generational time frame, why were they likely, some of them, really few of them, I mean, real percentages like 4% of priests, why were they likely 4% to become abusers? Why? I have theories about why. I don't know why. Nobody's studied why. And I think that's an important thing to study. I'm much more interested, though, in dealing with the pastoral consequences of what happened, rather than trying to figure out why it happened. And that's not to say I don't believe that people who are abusers do not deserve our pastoral care. They do. But that's not my context right now. You see what I'm saying? In other words, my context right now is dealing with young men in seminary. I do have thoughts about why I think that generation in particular, priests, were more likely to become abusive. They're just my theories.
So it's just that we need to stay off the context. I mean, it's very broad. I'm curious if there's
would say this. I don't think that sexual abuse was any less prevalent in the 19th century than in the 20th century. I think we have more ability because of those consequential changes in culture to talk about things. But not very well sometimes, and that becomes the issue. And again, we're stuck in male gender role questions, we're stuck in embarrassment questions, we're stuck in context. See, and I would say I really believe that a lot of seminarians who have been abused in the past may come to the seminary so they don't have to deal with the sexuality issues, which really they have to deal with them. Right.
And I like your ending where he all the things that you need to look at do, and it kind of, and the word came up into my mind and that's reconciliation.
Yes. Yeah. And maybe it will be the case, and maybe it won't in terms of abused and abuser. It's very complex. But I would highly recommend, if you're interested in all in this question, which all of us should be, that's the book. It's just so good and gives us so many insights, so I highly recommend it. Yes?
Abuse normally takes us a profound experience. Every treat isn't it subtle, systemic actions that degrade the human person, not just sexually.
Oh, it's not.
Racially and otherwise, can, is sometimes the most essential to create the environment for profound experiences. How do you relate what you said here to all forms?
Right. Well, and that's something that she raises in the book, which I think is important, is that some young people become susceptible to abuse because of the family dynamic. Not that the family is generating the abuse, but they generate sometimes a lack of self-esteem, for example, that gives the person, so she talks about a wide variety of cases. She talks about parents who basically prostitute their own children, and this is what happens. The parents aren't abusing them. They're certainly providing the ideal of abuse. And so it runs the gamut. And sometimes abuse isn't even sexual. I mean, it runs every kind of gamut, not even violent sometimes, but completely psychological. And that's another thing she talks about rather extensively, is that sometimes psychological abuse, even if it's not physical or sexual, will create a scenario for a person to be vulnerable to sexual abusers, even as adults. And that becomes one of the challenges. But, she talks about how so often with sexual abuse as a child, there are difficulties in maintaining relationships, the relationship between sexual abuse and prostitution, all of those, and pornography, all of those things become major. It's very complicated, much more so than our presentation can offer. But hopefully, I think all of us, particularly, probably all of us in this room, even parents, we should be aware of kind of what's happening and be aware of some of the signs, for example, that we might witness. Other questions? Yes.
Just kind of an observation. Thank you for this. This helps to understand the younger priests, the young men who are being ordained today, because we don't, my diocese, we haven't had anybody here in Meinrad for years.
What diocese? What? I never heard of it.
Anyway, because, a lot of times, we talk about the younger ones who are being ordained, and we don't understand where they're coming from. So this helps a little bit.
And I'm not implying that they've all been abused. But what I'm saying is, a lot of times, that kind of formalism that we experience in some newly ordained priests is a desire to not have to deal with any kind of personal crisis. Why? Because a person no longer exists. Now there's only the priest. And I exist as a priest and not as Bobby or whatever I am. Right? And so